The story most people know about Vietnam is that it was a war America misunderstood. That is not exactly right. What happened in Vietnam was not a failure of understanding. It was a failure of honesty. And the distinction matters, because misunderstanding implies good faith, implies that if someone had just explained things more clearly, the outcome might have been different. But the evidence, accumulated slowly over decades through declassified documents and veteran testimony and investigative journalism that arrived years too late to change anything, suggests something more deliberate. The people who ran the war understood a great deal of what was happening. They chose, systematically and with considerable effort, to report something else. This is not a story about a few bad actors or a single catastrophic decision. It is about an institution, the United States military, the Department of Defense, the executive branch across multiple administrations, deciding that the appearance of progress was more valuable than progress itself. And once that decision was made, once the metrics replaced the reality, the war did not just become dishonest. It became something stranger than that. It became a conflict in which the people fighting it were no longer sure what they were fighting for, in which success was defined by numbers that everyone privately knew were wrong, in which silence became its own form of participation. The 18 incidents described here were not all secret in the traditional sense. Some were reported partially, in language carefully chosen to obscure rather than illuminate. Some were known to hundreds of men on the ground and mentioned in letters home and discussed in mess halls and then absorbed into the official record as something else. A successful operation, a necessary action, a regrettable but unavoidable outcome. Some were never written down at all. What connects them is not their classification level or their geographic location or even their scale. What connects them is the gap, the consistent, documented, sometimes staggering gap between what happened and what was reported as having happened. That gap began before the first American combat troops landed. It was present in the early advisory years, when American officers were technically prohibited from engaging in combat and were therefore classified as observers even when they were flying combat missions and directing fire and dying in circumstances that required creative paperwork to explain. The gap was structural before it was cultural, and once you build a war on a structural dishonesty, everything that follows carries that original distortion forward. The body count was the clearest expression of this. The decision to use enemy casualties as the primary metric of success was not made carelessly. It was made because other metrics, territorial control, political stability, popular support for the South Vietnamese government, were either unquantifiable or trending in directions that nobody in Washington wanted to see in writing. Body count was clean. It was a number. It could be reported upward through the chain of command, accumulated into weekly totals, presented in briefings as evidence of momentum. General William Westmoreland and his staff genuinely believed for a period that if they could kill enough North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, they would eventually cross a threshold, what they called the crossover point, where they were killing the enemy faster than he could be replaced. What they did not account for, or chose not to account for, was that the enemy understood this metric too. North Vietnamese commanders adapted to it with considerable sophistication. They chose when to engage and when to withdraw. They accepted casualties in situations where engagement served their strategic goals and avoided casualties in situations where it did not. They understood that American units needed bodies to show for their operations, and they occasionally manipulated this need in ways that drew American forces into terrain and circumstances of the enemy's choosing. Meanwhile, the pressure to produce favorable body counts moved through the American command structure like a current. Units that reported high counts received praise. Units that reported low counts received questions. Officers who wanted to advance their careers understood what the numbers needed to look like. And so the numbers were adjusted, not always dramatically, not always consciously, but consistently, and in one direction. The first incident documented here is not famous. It does not have a name that most people would recognize. It occurred in the autumn of 1965, in the months following the Battle of Ia Drang, which was the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, and which was reported at the time as an American victory. After Ia Drang, the command was under pressure to demonstrate that search and destroy operations were working, that the new strategy of attrition was producing results. A series of operations in the Central Highlands generated body counts that were subsequently reported to Washington and then incorporated into official assessments of the war's progress. Veterans who participated in those operations later described a practice that had already become routine by that point. When a unit found bodies, the count was reported. When a unit found people who might have been combatants, or people in areas designated as free fire zones, or people who ran, the count was also reported. The distinction between confirmed enemy dead and probable enemy dead and possible enemy dead was noted in the original field reports, but frequently collapsed by the time the numbers traveled up the chain of command. By the time they reached Washington, they were simply dead enemy. How many of those dead were actually enemy combatants? Nobody could say with certainty, but the number moved in the right direction, and that was what mattered. In the same period, and in the same region, American units were operating under rules of engagement that were, on paper, carefully designed to limit civilian casualties. The reality on the ground was considerably more complicated. Free fire zones, officially called specified strike zones, were areas from which civilian populations had theoretically been evacuated and in which anything that moved could be treated as hostile. The theory was sound enough in the abstract. The practice depended entirely on whether evacuations had actually occurred, whether people had actually left, whether the boundaries of these zones were clearly marked and consistently observed. In many cases, they were not. Villages that were inside designated free fire zones on American maps had not been informed of this. People who were farming their ancestral land, people who had nowhere to go and no way to get there, people who were elderly or sick or caring for children or simply stubborn, remained in areas where their presence made them, legally and operationally, targets. This was documented by military lawyers, by civilian officials with the Agency for International Development, by reporters who occasionally managed to reach these areas. The documentation did not change the practice. It became part of the record that the record chose to ignore. The second incident involves a specific type of operation that was common throughout the war and almost never appeared in official reporting with any accuracy. These were operations against what the military classified as infrastructure, the political and administrative apparatus of the National Liberation Front in South Vietnamese villages and hamlets. The Phoenix program, which became the most organized expression of this effort, was officially described as a program to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through capture, defection, or killing. The word neutralize was doing considerable work in that sentence. The program was a joint American and South Vietnamese operation, and its implementation varied enormously by province and by the quality and integrity of the Vietnamese officials and American advisors involved. In some provinces, it functioned approximately as designed, identifying actual Viet Cong political operatives and either capturing them for interrogation or, where capture was not feasible, eliminating them. In other provinces, it became something else. Provincial officials used it to settle personal scores. People were named as Viet Cong infrastructure because they owed someone money, or because someone wanted their land, or simply because a quota needed to be filled and a name needed to be written down. American advisors attached to these operations were, in many cases, aware of this. A significant number of them reported it through official channels. A much smaller number of those reports resulted in any change in practice. The numbers generated by Phoenix were reported to Congress and to the public as evidence of the program's effectiveness. Those numbers included people who were killed, people who were captured, and people who defected. The ratio of killed to captured became, among people who examined it carefully, a source of considerable concern. A program genuinely oriented toward intelligence, toward extracting information about the enemy's organization and intentions, would have prioritized captures over kills. The numbers suggested a different emphasis. This was noted. It was not addressed. The third incident is quieter than the others, and in some ways more disturbing for its quietness. In the early years of the Air War, American pilots flying combat missions over North Vietnam were required to file mission reports that included their bomb damage assessment, their estimate of the damage caused to the targets they had struck. These assessments were based on observation from the aircraft, on photographs taken during or after the strike, and on the pilot's professional judgment. They were not independent. They were not verified on the ground. They could not be, because American ground forces were not operating in North Vietnam. The targets of the air war were, officially, military and industrial installations, supply lines, fuel depots, communications nodes, transportation infrastructure. The assessments of damage to these targets were incorporated into official reporting on the air war's effectiveness and used to justify continued and expanded bombing campaigns. The problem was that the assessments were systematically optimistic. Targets that had been struck and damaged were reported as struck and destroyed. Targets that had been missed were sometimes reported as struck. Targets that were struck and then repaired by North Vietnamese repair crews within days were carried in the official record as destroyed. This was not entirely or even primarily the result of dishonesty on the part of individual pilots. Some of it was. But most of it was the result of a system that generated incentives to report success and created no reliable mechanism for detecting and correcting optimistic reporting. The Secretary of Defense's office, under Robert McNamara, was deeply invested in systems analysis, in quantitative measures of progress. The air war's effectiveness was supposed to be measurable. The measurements that came back were, therefore, shaped by the need to be measurable in the right direction. The Strategic Air Command and the Tactical Air Command both maintained internal assessments that were, at various points, considerably more cautious than the assessments provided to civilian leadership. These internal assessments acknowledged restrike rates, the frequency with which targets that had been reported as destroyed needed to be struck again, which was itself evidence that they had not been destroyed the first time. The restrike data was available. It was not suppressed in any formal sense. It simply did not appear in the presentations to Congress or in the public statements of officials defending the air war's effectiveness. The fourth incident is one that appeared briefly in the press and then disappeared from the public conversation for years. It concerns the treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Conventions, to which the United States was a signatory, established clear rules for the treatment of captured combatants. American forces in Vietnam were bound by those rules, and American military law provided for the prosecution of soldiers who violated them. The reality of how prisoners were treated was considerably more varied than official policy suggested. The most systematic violations occurred not in the heat of contact, not in the moments immediately following a firefight when men were frightened and enraged, but in structured interrogation settings, in the facilities operated jointly by American intelligence personnel and South Vietnamese interrogators, where the purpose was to extract information, and where the methods used were determined by how urgently the information was needed and how seriously the people conducting the interrogation took the rules they were theoretically operating under. American personnel who were present at these interrogations later described a routine that bore little resemblance to the official guidelines. People were beaten. People were subjected to stress positions maintained for hours or days. People were threatened with death and sometimes killed. The information obtained through these methods was of variable quality. Information extracted under duress is unreliable, and the people conducting these interrogations understood this at some level. But the pressure to produce intelligence was constant, and the rules against abusive interrogation were inconsistently enforced at best. Reports of abusive interrogation practices did reach senior American officers. Some of those officers investigated them. Some of those investigations resulted in reprimands or reassignments. Very few resulted in prosecutions. The system's response to documented abuse was, with exceptions that proved the rule, to absorb it, to transfer the responsible individuals, to classify the relevant documents, and to continue. The fifth incident involves the war's relationship with its own dead. The American casualty reporting system was, in formal terms, quite precise. Each death was recorded, each was assigned a cause, each was incorporated into the running total that appeared in press releases and congressional testimony. The total, when it reached certain thresholds, generated public attention. The system for recording these deaths was therefore, from an institutional standpoint, something that needed to be managed as carefully as any other metric. Deaths in combat were clearly reportable. Deaths from wounds sustained in combat were reportable. Deaths from accidents were reportable, though the circumstances were sometimes described with a generality that obscured the specific nature of the accident. What was harder to categorize, and what the reporting system handled with the least consistency, were deaths that resulted from actions by American forces against American forces, what came to be called fragging, after the fragmentation grenades that were the weapon most commonly used. The fragging of officers and senior NCOs by their own men began as an isolated phenomenon in the late 1960s and became, by the early 1970s, a recognized and serious problem that military commanders discussed in internal communications with a frankness they did not bring to public statements. The documented cases where a death was officially attributed to enemy action or to accident, when internal investigations suggested otherwise, are difficult to quantify precisely because the investigations themselves were uneven. Some commands investigated aggressively. Others preferred a determination of accidental death because the alternative was a public acknowledgement of the degree to which the relationship between American soldiers and their leadership had deteriorated. The sixth incident concerns a category of operation that was, for much of the war, officially denied and then quietly acknowledged and then classified in ways that limited public examination for decades afterward. These were cross-border operations conducted in Cambodia and Laos at times when the United States government was publicly maintaining that no such operations were occurring. The bombing of Cambodia, which became public knowledge through investigative reporting in 1969 and then became a major political controversy, is the most well-known example. But the cross-border operations were broader than the bombing campaign and predated it significantly. Special Forces units were conducting operations in Laos and Cambodia years before the bombing campaign became systematic. These operations were covered by classified reporting channels that ran parallel to the normal military reporting structure, which meant that senior officers in Vietnam who were not read into the relevant programs had significant gaps in their understanding of what American forces were actually doing in their theater of operations. The civilian casualties caused by the Cambodia bombing, which was conducted under a program called Menu, with individual strikes named after courses of a meal, in a classification of absurdity that the people who designed it seem not to have noticed, were not counted in any official American casualty reporting. They could not be, because the operations that caused them did not officially exist. Decades later, when declassified documents allowed researchers to reconstruct the scale of the bombing, the estimates of civilian deaths ran into figures that would have generated enormous controversy had they been public at the time. The seventh incident is narrower than the others and concerns a specific operation in the summer of 1967 that illustrated the gap between the war's official narrative and its reality with unusual clarity. A series of search and destroy operations in Quang Ngai province generated body counts that were reported up the chain of command as significant enemy losses. A subsequent examination of the same area, conducted by a different American unit operating in the same province months later, found a landscape in which the population had been substantially displaced. The agricultural infrastructure had been destroyed, and the environment was one that produced exactly the kind of grievance and alienation that fueled Viet Cong recruitment. The connection between aggressive search and destroy operations and increased Viet Cong influence in affected areas was something that American pacification officials and civilian advisors had been arguing for years. The argument was that the military's approach to attrition was, in practice, counterproductive, that killing and displacing civilians, destroying their crops and their homes, created more enemies than it eliminated. This argument was made in internal documents. It was made in reports to senior officials. It was made by the senior civilian official responsible for pacification, Robert Comer, who ran the program known as CORDS, and who understood the relationship between military operations and civilian alienation better than most of the generals he worked alongside. The argument did not change the fundamental approach. The metrics remained metrics of destruction. The reports continued to reflect those metrics, and the alienated civilians continued to provide the Viet Cong with the support, passive or active, that allowed the organization to survive years of sustained military pressure. The eighth incident took place over the course of several months in 1968 and involves the reporting, or rather the non-reporting, of what American military planners understood about the enemy's capabilities in the period leading up to the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive, which began on January 30th, 1968, was a coordinated series of attacks against more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns that demonstrated with considerable violence that the enemy's capabilities had been dramatically underestimated in official reporting. The question of what American intelligence knew before Tet and when they knew it and what they reported upward was examined in considerable detail in subsequent years. What emerged from those examinations was a picture of intelligence information that was present in the system, that indicated the scale and ambition of what the enemy was planning, but that was processed through an analytical framework that made the correct interpretation difficult. The prevailing assessment, which Westmoreland's headquarters had been promoting throughout 1967 as part of the campaign to demonstrate progress, was that the enemy was weakening. The order of battle estimates, the counts of enemy forces, had been revised downward in the autumn of 1967 in ways that, some analysts argued at the time, did not reflect the available intelligence. The revision of order of battle estimates is a subject that has generated its own literature, including litigation. What is clear is that significant intelligence indicating an impending major offensive was available in the weeks before Tet, and that the official posture of the American command, communicated to the public through a series of optimistic briefings and statements in late 1967, did not reflect what the intelligence system was actually seeing. Whether this was the result of analytical failure, institutional pressure to maintain the optimistic narrative, or some combination of the two, is a question on which historians continue to disagree. What is not disputed is that the gap between the public narrative and the intelligence reality was substantial. The ninth incident is one of the most documented and, in some ways, most instructive examples of the war's institutional dishonesty because it was documented from within, by people who were operating inside the system and who were troubled enough by what they saw to create a record. This was the systematic falsification of bomb damage assessments during the air campaign against North Vietnam's transportation infrastructure. The Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, which ran from 1965 to 1968, was justified in part by claims about its effect on North Vietnam's ability to supply its forces in the south. The interdiction mission, the effort to cut the supply lines, was supposed to impose costs on the North that would eventually make continuation of the war prohibitive. The assessments of whether this was working came, as noted earlier, from the bombing missions themselves. What became clear over time, through internal Air Force and Navy analysis, was that the bombing was not working in the way the official assessments claimed. North Vietnam proved capable of repairing damaged infrastructure with extraordinary speed. The labor that could be mobilized for road and bridge repair vastly exceeded what American analysts had anticipated. The supply requirements of North Vietnamese forces in the south were, moreover, relatively modest. The enemy was not conducting industrial-scale warfare and did not require industrial-scale logistics. The amount of material that needed to move south could be moved through routes that survived or were quickly repaired despite continuous air attack. Internal studies that reached these conclusions existed within the system. They were produced by analysts who were doing their jobs honestly. In some cases, they reached senior officials. They did not change the public claims about the bombing's effectiveness. The Secretary of Defense continued to present metrics of missions flown and targets struck that implied the campaign was achieving its stated objectives. The gap between the internal assessments and the public claims was, in this case, documented in real time by people inside the Pentagon who found themselves in the uncomfortable position of knowing that what they were being asked to support publicly was not what the evidence supported privately. The 10th incident involves the South Vietnamese military, and specifically the systematic overestimation of its capabilities and its commitment to the war that American reporting sustained for years. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, was central to the American strategy from the beginning. The strategy always included, at least nominally, the objective of building a South Vietnamese military capable of defending the country without American assistance. The degree to which this objective was being achieved was reported through a system called the Hamlet Evaluation System, which assigned numerical ratings to units and provinces and which produced data that was incorporated into assessments of the war's progress. The gap between what the Hamlet Evaluation System reported and what American advisors attached to ARVN units observed was frequently significant. ARVN units were rated on criteria that included training levels, equipment status, leadership quality, and operational effectiveness. The ratings were produced by South Vietnamese officials and American advisors who were both subject to pressures that made optimistic assessments professionally advantageous. American advisors attached to units that rated poorly were implicitly responsible for the poor ratings. South Vietnamese officials who rated their own units poorly were suggesting that the program they were administering was failing. The result was a dataset that showed consistent improvement in ARVN capabilities over most of the war's duration, right up to the point where ARVN units began to collapse in the field in ways that the dataset had given no indication of anticipating. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975, which was startlingly rapid, was in part a consequence of the fact that the actual state of ARVN readiness had never been accurately reflected in the official record. American planners making decisions about the pace of withdrawal, about the level of residual support required, about whether Vietnamization, the program to transfer the war to South Vietnamese forces, was succeeding, were working with data that had been shaped by the institutional pressures described above. The 11th incident is less about strategic dishonesty and more about the particular horror of how individual units adapted to the war's logic in ways that generated incidents that then needed to be managed by the institutional structure. In the years following the height of American involvement, a pattern emerged in investigations and court-martial proceedings that pointed to something beyond individual misconduct. Units in certain areas and under certain command conditions had developed practices: the killing of prisoners, the fabrication of scenarios to justify civilian casualties, the construction of false narratives for official reports that were not the spontaneous expressions of individual soldiers' moral failures, but rather the systematic products of command climates that prioritized body counts over everything else, including the legal and moral constraints on how the war was supposed to be conducted. The Army's own investigations, conducted in the years following My Lai, examined dozens of alleged incidents. Many of those investigations were limited by the difficulty of gathering evidence after the fact, by the reluctance of witnesses to testify against people who had been their fellow soldiers, and by a command structure that had reasons to limit the scope of what the investigations found. The reports produced by these investigations, the ones that were produced because some were not, were in many cases classified and remained so for years. The 12th incident concerns a geographic area, the A Shao Valley in the northwest corner of Tua Tien province, that appeared repeatedly in the official record as a site of significant military operations and significant American victories, and that nevertheless remained, throughout the war, a major North Vietnamese logistical corridor. This was not hidden from the people who were responsible for assessing the war's progress. The re-infiltration of the valley, The re-establishment of enemy presence in areas that had been cleared at significant cost in American and South Vietnamese lives was documented in intelligence reporting that contradicted the official narrative of progress. Operations into the A Shau Valley, including the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill in 1969, in which American forces suffered heavy casualties taking a hilltop that was subsequently abandoned, generated public controversy precisely because they illustrated the way the war's logic had become untethered from any coherent strategic objective. You took the hill because the hill was there. You reported the casualties inflicted and the hill taken as evidence of success. You then abandoned the hill because holding it served no purpose that anyone could clearly articulate. The enemy moved back in. You noted this in your intelligence reporting. The cycle continued. The 13th incident involves the reporting of the effects of Agent Orange and other herbicide agents used in Operation Ranch Hand, the aerial defoliation program that stripped millions of acres of jungle and cropland in an effort to deny the enemy cover and food. The program was officially described as a military necessity, and its effects on human health were, for years, officially described as negligible. The evidence that these herbicides, particularly the dioxin-contaminated Agent Orange, had serious health effects on exposed populations was present in scientific literature that the military and the Department of Defense were aware of. Internal reviews of the health effects existed. Studies were commissioned, and their results were, in some cases, handled in ways that delayed public availability of information that would have been inconvenient. The Vietnamese civilian population was exposed to these agents on a scale that was, for decades, not part of the American public's understanding of the war. The long-term health effects on those populations, elevated cancer rates, birth defects in subsequent generations, contamination of soil and water that persisted for decades, were not part of the official accounting of the war's costs. They appeared in internal reports that did not become part of the public record until much later. The 14th incident concerns the reporting of what was happening to American prisoners of war in North Vietnamese captivity. The official position of the American government, through most of the war, was that it had incomplete information about the condition and treatment of American POWs. This was true in the sense that complete information was unavailable. It was misleading in the sense that available information, including information provided by returning prisoners who were debriefed extensively, indicated that prisoners were being subjected to systematic torture and that this torture was not, as North Vietnam publicly maintained, the result of individual guards' behavior, but was rather a sanctioned method of extracting military information and of producing public statements by American prisoners that could be used for propaganda purposes. The decision about how prominently to acknowledge this reality was a political and diplomatic decision as much as a military one. There were periods when public acknowledgement of POW mistreatment served American diplomatic and domestic political interests, and periods when it did not. The information was managed accordingly. This management, the release of information when it was useful and the suppression of the same information when it was inconvenient, was not, in formal terms, a violation of any specific regulation. It was a manifestation of the broader pattern by which truth in Vietnam was treated as a resource to be allocated strategically rather than an obligation to be met consistently. The 15th incident involves the morale of American forces in the later years of the war and the degree to which the official reporting of morale corresponded to the reality observed by anyone operating close to the ground. By 1970 and 1971, the American military in Vietnam was in a state that its own internal assessments described, in language that became progressively more alarmed, as approaching a crisis. Drug use was endemic. Racial tensions within units had reached levels that produced violence. The relationship between soldiers and officers had, in many units, deteriorated to the point where the basic functioning of command authority was in question. This was reported internally with some accuracy. The Army commissioned studies, investigators were sent, reports were written. The reports documented what anyone who had spent time with American units in the field already knew, which was that the force was struggling in ways that extended well beyond the tactical. What was not reported with any accuracy that reached the public was the degree to which this deterioration was a consequence of the war's fundamental dishonesty. Soldiers who understood that the metrics were false, who had watched body count figures be adjusted upward, who had participated in operations that made no strategic sense and had been told that they made strategic sense anyway, who had been killed and had watched their friends be killed in places they would be back at in 6 months, had developed an understanding of their situation that the official narrative did not accommodate. The gap between what they were told was happening and what they could see was happening had become, for many of them, the central fact of their experience. The 16th incident concerns the final years of American involvement and a specific pattern in the reporting of South Vietnamese military performance during the period known as Vietnamization. As American forces withdrew, the official narrative required that ARVN forces be performing increasingly well, that the transfer of responsibility was proceeding successfully, and that South Vietnam was developing the capacity to defend itself. The reports produced by the Military Assistance Command Vietnam reflected this narrative with a consistency that, given the complexity of the actual situation, should itself have been a warning sign. In the field, American advisors who remained with South Vietnamese units were sending reports that were often considerably more mixed than the summary assessments suggested. Units that were rated as effective were performing poorly. Units that had received extensive American training and equipment were dissolving when they encountered determined opposition. The command-level assessments that rolled these ground-level observations into summary judgments were, consistently, more optimistic than the raw data supported. The decision-makers who were using these assessments to determine the pace of American withdrawal and the residual support to be provided were therefore making decisions based on a picture of South Vietnamese military capability that was, in important respects, false. The consequences of these decisions became apparent in the spring of 1975. The rapidity of the South Vietnamese collapse, the rate at which units that had been assessed as effective simply ceased to function, was, among military analysts, a source of profound retrospective embarrassment about the accuracy of the assessment system. The 17th incident is perhaps the one that most directly illustrates the relationship between institutional dishonesty and human cost, because it involves decisions made about operations that were known internally to have a very low probability of achieving their stated military objectives, and a high probability of producing significant casualties, and that were conducted anyway because the political requirement to demonstrate activity and commitment overrode the military judgment that the activity was not worth its cost. The late war operations in which American units sustained casualties in actions that senior officers privately assessed as strategically marginal, actions designed primarily to demonstrate to the South Vietnamese government that American commitment remained strong, or to provide negotiating leverage in the Paris talks, or simply because to stand down would have required admitting that the position being defended was indefensible, generated a category of death that the official record did not acknowledge. These were not deaths that occurred despite the best efforts of the command. They were deaths that occurred as a consequence of institutional requirements that had nothing to do with military necessity. The families of the men who died in these operations received the same letters and the same official accounts as the families of men who died in operations that made military sense. The distinction did not appear in any official document. The 18th incident is not a single event. It is a condition. It is the state that the war had reached by its final years, in which the institutional structures designed to report on the war's progress and guide its conduct had become so thoroughly shaped by the need to produce favorable outcomes that they had lost the capacity to accurately represent reality. The intelligence system was generating assessments that reflected what the command wanted to hear. The body count system was producing numbers that bore an uncertain relationship to the actual attrition being imposed on the enemy. The ARVN evaluation system was showing improvement that was not occurring. The air war assessments were claiming effectiveness that was not being achieved. The pacification program was reporting progress in provinces where, on the ground, The situation was deteriorating. The people who operated these systems, the intelligence analysts, the order of battle specialists, the unit commanders, the advisors, the operations officers, were not, as a group, dishonest people. Many of them were trying to do their jobs accurately. The system they were operating within, however, had evolved in ways that made accurate reporting professionally costly and favorable reporting professionally rewarded. And the cumulative effect of thousands of individual accommodations to this incentive structure was a picture of the war that was, in aggregate, false. This picture was presented to the public through press conferences and congressional testimony and official statements. It was used to justify continued expenditure of money and lives. It was used to make decisions about strategy and force levels and the pace of withdrawal. And it produced in the end a situation in which the people who needed accurate information most, the policymakers who were responsible for deciding whether and how the war should continue, were the people least likely to receive it. The soldiers who served in Vietnam knew, at a level that was visceral and immediate and impossible to mistake, that what they were experiencing was not what was being reported. They knew this from the body count adjustments they had witnessed. They knew it from the operations they had participated in that made no sense. They knew it from the briefings they had attended in which official progress was described in terms that bore no relationship to the landscape they operated in. They knew it from the fact that they were fighting in the same places, over and over, and being told each time that the area had been cleared and secured. What they did not always know, and what many of them spent years afterward trying to understand, was how complete and systematic the misrepresentation had been. The individual incidents they had witnessed, the body count adjusted upward, the civilian deaths reported as enemy kills, the mission report that described a disaster as a success, seemed to them like aberrations, like the failures of particular men in particular circumstances. They were not. They were expressions of a systemic pattern that extended from the individual fire team up through the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The war continued for years after the people running it had lost confidence in the strategy they were executing. It continued after the intelligence community had concluded in internal assessments that were not shared with the public, that the war could not be won on terms that any American administration could accept. It continued after the military leadership had begun, in private, to express doubts about the approach that they continued to defend in public. It continued because the institutional momentum of a large military enterprise, once established, is very difficult to stop, and because stopping it required admitting publicly what had been known privately for years. The cost of that gap, between the private knowledge and the public admission, was borne by the people who continued to serve and die in a war that its own managers had privately concluded was unwinnable. The gap was maintained by the same institutional mechanisms that had sustained the body count figures and the air war assessments and the ARVN evaluations and all the other metrics that had substituted for truth throughout the war's duration. There was no single moment at which the decision was made to continue the war, despite the knowledge that it was failing. There was instead a continuous series of smaller decisions. To not share this assessment, to soften that conclusion, to describe this setback as a temporary reversal, to attribute that failure to circumstances rather than strategy. Each of these decisions was made by individuals who were operating within institutions that had structured incentives around them, and each of them added to the weight of the accumulation. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. The last American combat forces left. The military assistance continued at reduced levels until Congress cut it. The South Vietnamese government continued to fight, with the equipment and training it had received, against an enemy that had not been attrited to the crossover point and had not been interdicted into submission and had not been pacified and had not been persuaded that the political cost of continuing was greater than the cost of stopping. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. The evacuation of the American embassy was conducted by helicopter. The photographs of that evacuation are among the most reproduced images of the 20th century. The official casualty count for American forces in Vietnam is 58,220 killed. The count of Vietnamese dead, North and South, civilian and military, runs into millions, though the precise figure has never been and cannot be established. The last American combat death in Vietnam occurred on a date that is recorded in the official record. The war had by that point been continuing for longer than most of the men who died in it had been alive.